Hi there. So we'll wait maybe another minute or so, just to see if there's anyone else coming, and then we'll get started. Handouts up here if anyone wants. Okay, the learning tonight is dedicated Le'iloi Nishmas Joe Tannenbaum of blessed memory. All of our learning over tonight and tomorrow is dedicated in his memory. May his neshama have an aliyah with great gratitude to all that he did for this community and for us who are the beneficiaries. Okay, so someone walked in earlier and said, okay, just what's the bottom line? Okay. And the answer is that it's not a simple matter, which is why you may notice that there's a tension, as far as, whether a woman should be allowed to speak from the bima, or when do we allow a woman to speak in general. So the whole idea of speaking just from the bima is it really a secondary issue. The primary issue is, should we allow a woman to be giving public addresses at all? And that's an issue that's debated by the halacha. Come on in. No problem. I gave one to Craig. Okay, so I'd like to get started with the sources. And the sources are going to be a bit of a shock to the system if you've never seen these Gemaras before, because it's going to sound like we're in real trouble here. Okay, so the first Gemara that we're going to see is a Gemara in Maseches Brachos. Amar Shmuel, Kol bi'isha erva. The voice of a woman is considered to be a source of erva, is an exposure, and is an exposure of a woman. The Torah uses the term erva to describe being uncovered, being exposed. And the Torah says that it's something that's forbidden, right? So shenemar, and how do I know that a woman's voice is erva? It's an exposure of a woman which is forbidden. Shenemar ki kolech arev umar eich naveh, as it says in Shir Hashirim, that your voice is pleasant and your appearance is lovely or comely. And as Rashi says, where do we see from the words ki kolech arev, your voice is pleasant? The fact that scripture lauds a woman because of her voice, shmamina ta'avahi. We see from here that man has a natural urge or lust after a woman's voice, just like he has after the appearance of an attractive woman. So, what does that mean exactly? So you would say, well, that's got nothing to do with what we're talking about. What is that Gemara referring to? Singing, you would think it's Kol Isha, right? Which is the name of my house cleaner, Kol Isha. No, I'm just kidding. But in any event, Amarle Rav Nachman lo Rav Yehuda. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Yehuda in the Gemara in Maseches Kiddushin. This is part of a much longer conversation. And in this conversation, Rav Nachman is speaking to Rav Yehuda. Now, Rav Nachman was the Reish Galusa, so he's the figure of authority. And he's also married to a big Talmidah Chachama whose name was? She's the second most famous woman in all of Talmud. Most famous is Bruria. Who's the second most famous woman? Her name is Yalta. Yalta, okay? So there's stories about Yalta in the Gemara, which we're not going to go into tonight, but she was a very wise woman. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Yehuda, Nishader leimar shalma li Yalta. He says, my wife is at home. Please, now that you're visiting me, come say hi to my wife Yalta. So Amar Lei, so Rav Yehuda said back to him, Shuldigmir Rav, Hachi Amar Shmuel kol bi'isha erva. I'm sorry, but I can't because a woman's voice is erva. Rashi, Shenemar hashmini es kolech v'im eshal bishloma tishiveni. So Rashi says explicitly, what does Rashi say? If I say, Rebbitzin Yalta, how are you? She's going to say back to me, I'm fine, thank you, how are you? And I will hear her voice. And that's going to be a problem of Kol Be'isha Erva. Azoizak Rashi in the Gemara. Now, clear from the context of the story that Rav Yehuda was not concerned about Yalta serenading him after he would say, how are you, Rebbitzin? Okay? So it's clear that Kol Be'isha Erva extends beyond singing according to this Gemara. And then the Gemara continues, and Rav Nachman pressed him further, Afshar al Yidei Shaliach, why don't you ask how my wife is doing by asking a Shaliach to be your go-between, and that way you don't have to listen to her voice. Amar lei hachi Amar Shmuel ein shoalin b'shlomisha. No, I'm sorry, but my Rebbe said you're not allowed to ever inquire about the welfare of a woman, which implies even if you do it via proxy. Like even if I were to go over to say to you, can you say hello to your wife, please, for me? Send regards to your wife. That would be, or ask your wife how she's doing, or send her my regards, something like that. That's not okay, according to Shmuel. Al Yedei Baila, but at least I can send regards, said Rav Nachman. Amar lehachi Amar Shmuel, ein shoalin bishlom isha klal. That's not appropriate at all. And so how this translates into psak halacha, there certainly could be a potential for inappropriateness of sending regards to one's wife, or sending regards to a woman who is an erva that you're not married to. Let's see. Now, there's a lot of raid. There's a lot of makoros to discuss here, and I've decided to cut to the chase tonight because we have limited time. So, Rav Yosef Chaim Baghdad, the Ben Yehoyada, has a beautiful sort of synopsis of this whole sugya, where he tries to drill down and figure out what in the world is going on. What does the Gemara mean when it says, Kol Bi'isha Erva? So he says, so he quotes this Gemara on the Gemara in Kiddushin, Perish Rashi, She'namar Hashmini es kolech v'imesh al bishloma tishiveni. So he just quotes Rashi on the Gemara. And he says, V'davar ze yipalei be'enai. He says, this is just so incredibly surprising. It's shocking to me, he says. V'chi hayitachen lomar sha'asur ledaber shum dibor im isha? Question mark. Are you going to suggest that it's forbidden to ever hold a conversation with a woman? Kidei shelo yishma kola, so that a person will not listen to her voice. V'halo bivnot tzlofchad ketiva ta'amodna lifnei Moshe v'lifnei Elazar hakohen v'chulei petach oel moed le'mor avinu meit bamidbar v'chulei. What about the story of Benos Tzlofchad? They stood right there in front of Moshe and Aaron, and they spoke. And Moshe and Aaron listened to them. What about Kol Bi'isha Erva? So, okay. So you're going to say it's context dependent, perhaps. Let's see. Ve'ech dibru imahem v'shamu kolam. How could Moshe and Aaron speak to them and listen to their voice? Okay. Ve'im toimar al yedei meturgeman. Maybe you'll tell me that there was some kind of go-between. So the Moshe and Aaron didn't have to speak to them directly. How could the go-between, presumably a male, no matter how you cut it, if it's a female, then it's a problem because you're not solving the problem. But if it's a male, how does the male meturgeman, the go-between, have a right to listen to them? Ve'ech diber David hamelech alav hashalom im Avigail v'dibra imo v'shama devareha. We know from Sefer Shmuel that David HaMelech has a conversation with Avigail long before they're married, while she's still an Eshes Ish. She's still married to a man. And how could he have a conversation with her? By what right? Ve'ech diber Eliyahu zachur latovim ha'isha hatzarafit. And how could Eliyahu speak to the Tzarafit woman and he performed a miracle for her? Ve'heshiva oto davar v'shama kola. And he spoke with her, and he heard her voice. They had a conversation. This week's parsha, this week's haftorah, what we did from this past Shabbos. The Shunammite woman has a conversation with Elisha the Navi. How is that permitted? And that's Craig, that's not in Basin. The Im Toimar. And maybe you'll say, Al Yedei Gechazi, maybe you'll say that Elisha did not speak with her directly, but rather via his ward, or his, what would you call him? Gechazi, his assistant, or his scribe, or his, I don't know. Gechazi eichitur legechazi lishma kolas. But if that's the case, then how could Gechazi listen to her voice? V'hinei bevadai, masha katuv hashmi'ini et kolech, Iri b'midaberes b'derech shir v'shira. So this, first of all, there's no question, says the Ben Yehoyada, that when it says in the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, "Let me hear your voice," we're not talking about a woman who's let's say the short order, the waitress at the Greasy Spoon saying, "One order of fries for table 6." That's not Kol Isha. It's got to be a pleasant voice that is either singing or saying some kind of something poetic, the Chayotze. Ve'ein lilmod mizeh da'asu lishmoa kol min kol devarim shel isha. And you can't learn from there that you can't listen to a woman's voice at all. So that goes back to the question, why then did Rav Yehuda use that as the argument for not having a nice, just short conversation with Mrs. Yalta, with Rebbitzin? Va'od kasha. Eich amar le Rav Nachman efshar al yedei shaliach. Dim asr li'ish lishmoa kol isha, eich utar l'shaliach lishmoa kol isha. And why did Rav Nachman, why was he prepared to say, well, you can send regards to Yalta, my wife, through a proxy? And at that stage in the Gemara, he wasn't even suggesting himself. He was saying via somebody else. But how could that somebody else speak to Yalta? Okay. V'doichak lomar kegon lishloach la al yedei bana. Maybe you'll say that the go-between was maybe her son, and that was what he had in mind. The shaliach bistam kamerle, because Rav Nachman didn't qualify it by saying my son can be the go-between. He said a shaliach can be the go-between. So based on the weight of all of these questions, the Ben Yehoyada says as follows: V'nirali b'siyata dishmaya. Devadai im yedabru ha'ish v'hi'isha b'dvarim shel esek ba'alma leitlan ba. He says, if you're engaged in some kind of formal business affair or some manner of transaction or just some kind of regular discourse with a woman that's not your wife, that's a woman that is usher to you, for example, there's absolutely no problem with that at all, says the Ben Yehoyada. He says, V'rak im ha'isha mashmat kola b'divrei shir, o bidvarim shel chiba she'einam litzorach davar va'esek. Or if she's, the only time it's usher is when she's singing, or even when she's not singing, but she's engaged in cordial niceties. And what he means by that is that when a man and a woman speak about how pleasant it is to see you, I'm so happy to see you, it's so nice to see you, how's your family? My family's fine. How's your family? My kids are fine. These are my grandchildren. And they start conversing in an endearing fashion. That's where the Ben Yehoyada says that this is a problem. V'chein dvarim shel prisat shalom. Any kind of engagement in, let's say, just inquiring about how everyone's doing. So you hear the distinction that he's making. You can ask a woman for directions. If you're lost, you can engage with a woman in a business transaction. But once it becomes something personal that infringes, let's say, engages in a friendly conversation that creates friendship between a man and a woman, that's where the Ben Yehoyada says that it's problematic. Well, let's see. Let's see if it's a single man. A single man and a single woman is not going to be an issue. The Mishnah Berurah actually says that explicitly, that even the potentially issues, other issues of kol isha will not be a problem if the girl is not a nida and she's a permissible person. If she's not an erva, then there may not be an issue of kol isha. Okay. V'lachein bidvarim elu shel prisat shalom amar le Rav Nachman efshar al yedei shaliach. And so that's why Rav Yehuda objected, and therefore Rav Nachman said to him, well, then use a proxy. Ki dvarim elu afal pi shehem prisat shalom hinehem etzel hashaliach kemo sha'ar devarim shel esek de'ein bazeh chiba ben hashaliach uvein ha'isha. So he says that's why Rav Nachman suggested the solution of using a proxy, like a go-between, because the shaliach, when Yalta says, tell me how your children are doing, Rav Yehuda, tell me how your wife is doing, tell me how your mishpacha is doing, the shaliach has no vested interest. It's not friendship. It's not a friendly conversation for the go-between. So for him, it's just business. Okay, so for him, it's not kol be'isha erva. It would only be kol be'isha erva for Rav Yehuda, who is hearing endearing language, a language of endearment from a woman that's not his wife. Aval legabei ishto shel Rav Nachman v'Rav Yehuda chashiv kedivrei chiba. Okay, the asur lishmoa kola bidvarim elu, because that's why it would only be asur for Rav Yehuda to hear it directly from Yalta, but not directly from a proxy. V'achar Tan Rav Yehuda mishum da'amar Shmuel ein sholem b'shlom isha klal v'lav mishum kol. And then Rav Yehuda came to another conclusion, that you're not allowed to inquire the welfare of a married woman at all, not because of kol b'isha erva, but because of extra added sniut. And that's just, it's like it's of a different genre. But if we're just speaking about the issue of kol b'isha or kol isha, so then Rav Yehuda was going beyond that. Okay, we're not going to see the rest of the Ben Yehoyada. You can look at that on your own time. He just really brings another source to confirm that. Okay, so far, are we okay? How by the way, do a boy and girl go out and date when it's time for shidduchim?
Sign
Yeah, or maybe a go-between. Yeah. A chaperone. Chaim? It could be that the Ben Yehoyada would say that you shouldn't be engaging in a friendly conversation, even with a stepdaughter. Kol b'isha erva. We haven't resolved all of the situations yet, but at least we've gotten some level of clarity. Okay? Yes, Laser.
After we had Vayomer love, their dots on the word love. And the Drasha in the Gemara is that Vayomer love, he's supposed to ask about. Is that only?
And what is the reason for the dots?
That they pointed out the Malachim to Abraham that and the Gemara learned from there that you're supposed to ask. Now the question is you're supposed to ask about the.
They asked her also where he is Ayo.
Right.
No, but they asked Abraham where is your way. They weren't speaking to him.
Yeah, but
I don't know, but the thoughts indicate that they also asked Ayo, and they asked Sarah, where's Abraham?
Really?
Rashi says.
Okay. I haven't seen the Rashi, but we'll take a quick look at the Rashi. Okay, so Rashi, Azoy Zakt Rashi, Vayomeru Elav Nakud al Aleph Yud Vav Shebe Elav, V'Tanya Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer Kol Makom Shehaksav Rabba al Hanakuda Ata Doresh Haksav V'Kan Hanakuda Rabba al Haksav Ata Doresh Hanakuda. So the issue is Aleph Yud Vav. Okay, Sha'af L'Sara Shalu Ayo Avraham is exactly as David had said. Lamadnu sheyishal adam ba'achsanya shelo liish al ha'isha u'liisha al ha'ish. Gemara in Bava Metzia, that you're supposed to, is a way of endearing the husband to the wife and the wife to the husband. you say, how is your wife to the husband? And you say, how is your husband to the wife? Okay? And in the parentheses, it's brought down that Yodin hayu malachi hashares Sara imenu heichan haisa ela lahodia shetzinua haisa kedei lechavava al baila. They mentioned where is your wife Sarah in order to endear her to her husband by causing Avraham to remember, Sarah is in the tent, so she's a tzinua. Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina kedei l'shager la kos shel bracha. They asked in order that after Birkas Hamazon, they could give her the kos shel bracha, which is also related to the story of Yalta, because the story in the Gemara in Brachos about Yalta is that she wanted to drink the kos shel bracha. Okay, so apparently Rav Yehuda was hesitant to do even that. So it could be that there's a machlokes of Amoraim in the Gemara. If the objective is to inquire about the welfare of a spouse to the husband in order to lechavava al baila, it could be that even Rav Yehuda might agree to that. Okay? But in this kind of situation, perhaps Rav Yehuda perceived that he wasn't deriving that benefit at all, and therefore he felt it inappropriate. Okay. I'm thankful to Reb Tzvika Reisman and his Sefer Ratz Katzvi for providing me with some of the Makoros tonight, not all of them, but some of them. I'd like to look at now the Nishmas Avraham, which is normally, as Laser is very aware, is really a set of responsa of halachic issues regarding medical issues, but interspersed, he does have some interludes where he goes a little bit off-road. And in this case, he quotes the Gedolim of his generation, Rav Avraham Sofer, who wrote the Nishmas Avraham, and he discusses the issue of Kol B'Isha Erva. He says, Agav, I hope you can read it. I'm a little bit, it's a little bit tiny. He says, Agav, Mashikosev HaMishnah Brura v'zemer Eishes Ish v'chein Kol Ha'arayos La'olam Asur Lishmoa. The Mishnah Brura writes that you're not permitted to listen to a woman singing. And we're not going to get into the heterim today that might potentially exist about listening to a woman's voice via a recording. For those Barbara Streisand fans out there, we're not going to go into that. Re'ei ma shekosev hashulchan aruch b'simin reish pei beis if gimel hakol oilam leminyan shiva afilu isha avol amru chachamim isha lo tikra b'tzibur mipnei kvod hatzibur. But I do refer you to what the Shulchan Aruch writes based on the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara says that every person in shul can be counted as one of the 7 aliyahs on Shabbos that are called to the Torah. Everyone can get an aliyah, including women. But the reason why women don't get an aliyah is because of kvod hatzibur, out of honor to the tzibur. Same reason for a minor as well. Anyone who's not chayiv, the simple understanding is if you're not chayiv in Talmud Torah, you take a back seat to a man who's chayiv in Talmud Torah. That's the simple understanding, correct. Now, there should be an obvious question based on our discussion of Kol B'Isha Erva. It seems from the Gemara that the reason is because of Kvod Hatzibur, however we're going to define that. But isn't there a more fundamental reason why a woman should not be called to the Torah to read from the Torah? What about Kol Isha? Okay. So, V'lichora, and it says, it would seem to me, imhi koreit batorah, kifi shahaya bizman chazal, shekol oleh kara et parshato. Now let's consider the whole thing, the system that we have today, where a person gets an aliyah and then the Baal Kriya lanes. That's not what happened in the times of the Gemara. In the times of the Gemara, every person who got the aliyah read his aliyah. And it was only later post-Talmudic, where the rabbis realized that Amaratzim who couldn't lane, they would never get an aliyah. So we had to change the system somewhat. So the question is, what about Vilama? He says, Vadai hitzricha likro b'ta'amim. She would have to read with the trop. V'lama in kan kol bi'isha erva. Why is there not a problem of a woman singing? The kasha lechalek she'ein ze nikra zemer, ki vada yesh hana'a lehashoimim me'etzem hanigun shebakriya ve'ein ze kriya ba'alma. He says, and it's contrived, he says, to distinguish between singing and laning. He says, because in my opinion, laning provides the same kind of hana'ah, the pleasure of hearing someone sing, which, by the way, is quite interesting, isn't it? You know, laning is a form of musical incantation, which is, you know, if you listen to some of the bar mitzvahs, you wish that you would listen to a fingernail scratching on the chalkboard. But I digress. But in any event, now I want to let you know. So I'm just gonna digress for just a moment. When I was a young Rav, and I took a Steller in Pennsylvania, where it was, you know, it was in a very out-of-town community, and there were a lot of things that were done in that shul that would never fly in the big city. One of the things that they did in the shul before I had gotten there is that for the bat mitzvah ceremony, they would allow the bat mitzvah, because they had to compete with the Reform and the Conservative, they would allow the bat mitzvah to go up to the bima, open up the chumash, and read her Haftorah portion. For those girls who wanted to learn Haftorah, they would read it from a chumash. So in theory, what are the issues there? She's not making any brachas, so it's not a bracha levatala. She's not getting an aliyah, but it's a mock bar mitzvah, okay? So I had a lot of shilas. So I called my Rosh Yeshiva at the time, Rav Yaakov Weinberg of blessed memory, and I asked him, can I continue this practice? And I said, first of all, it's a mock service, and it's really not authentic. It's not genuine. It's not real. He said, you can continue the practice, because otherwise you'll have a rebellion of the left of the flank of the shul. So I said, but what about kol isha? And he said, I hold that laning is not kol isha. And that was his way of understanding it. So I had my psak, and so I did allow it. We didn't have that many girls, I have to say, that did it. Probably in the 7 years that I was there, maybe there were 4 or 5 girls who actually ever got up to lane their Haftorah. But it was an interesting experience. And I do have to say, I just distinctly remember one young lady who had such a beautiful, melodious voice that when she was laning, I felt I was at the opera. And so I sort of internally questioned my Rosh Yeshiva's psak, because the way she was laning was not the way that you would normally listen to laning. It was mamish beautiful, like hearing a bird sing. And so, okay, but nu. So that's the way it was. So the Nishmas Avraham says, I have difficulty distinguishing between singing and laning. Va'ayin ba'orchos chayim shekotev b'shem bal ha'aseres dibros she'ein hanoshim motziim hanoshim yidei chovatam b'kriyat ha'megillah v'hatam mishum dekol be'isha erva. There are certain achronim who say that the reason why a woman cannot read the Megillas Esther for a man, putting aside all of the issues of what's the level of chiyuv of listening or to the Megillah, where it would seem that a woman has the same level of obligation as a man. But there's another issue, that if a woman would read the Megillah for a man, it would be prohibited, because kol be'isha erva. So we do have women's Megillah readings, but what if a man is so progressive that not only does he want there to be a women's Megillah reading, but he wants to attend the women's Megillah reading? Would we allow such a thing? So these achronim say that you can't allow it because kol be'isha erva. Okay, va'ayin sham shekosei v'hakol olam leminyan shiva afilu isha v'katan v'amru chazal isha lo tikra b'tzibim nekvorat tzibor v'lo katav mishum kol isha be'erva v'tzarach li iyun gadol. And so one of the achronim writes, he doesn't understand. Why doesn't the Gemara say that the reason why a woman can't be one of the 7 aliyahs on Shabbos is because kol be'isha erva? Why is it only because of kvodat tzibor? So then he says, "Ve'ulai tzarich lomar she'ein medubar bi'isha shekoret batorah ela rak mevarechet, v'lachein lo tikra mipnei kvod hatzibur. Maybe it's only talking about a woman who's saying the bracha and she's not reading and someone else will read for her, even though that was not the conventional practice. That's a possibility. Now I'm skipping down to the end of his notes and he says, let's just go to the next part. He says, Vikosavli, so when I was bothered by this question, I wrote to Rav Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, and I asked him, how do you understand the issue of Kol Isha Erva? Why doesn't Taka the Gemara say that a woman can't be counted as one of the aliyahs because of her voice? So number one, Rav Waldenberg answered as follows: She'medubar bipinuya she'ena nida she'enana bichlal arayot umutar lishmoa kol zemer mimena uchemadgish gam haMishnah Berurah b'simin ayin hey sifkat yud zayin. The Mishnah Berurah actually writes that the prohibition of kol isha only applies to a woman who is forbidden to you, because a person might be excited about a woman that is inaccessible to him, that is not permissible to him, such as a woman who's a nidah or a woman who's a married woman, and so forth. He says, "V'kosei b'penuya she'nida b'chlal ha'arayot." The only reason why you can't listen to a single woman sing is if she's already menstruating. But v'chein ki kol zemer shel penuya rak bishat kriya shema aser. The only time you can't listen to any woman singing is when you're engaged in a davar shebikdusha like Kriya Shema. But if stam azor you wanted to listen to, let's say, a prepubescent girl singing, there's absolutely no problem with that at all. So, and that's actually how we paskin. So it could be that when the Gemara says that a woman can be called up technically, but can't because of Kvod HaTzibur and doesn't discuss Kol B'Isha Erva, we could be talking about a single girl who is not a nidah, either because she went to mikvah, maybe she knew she was going to get an aliyah, so she went to mikvah, or she's prepubescent and therefore it's not a problem. Or 16, but she has to have gone to the mikvah because. Okay, a menopausal woman, right? Yeah, again, correct. Number two, says Rav Waldenberg, another possibility is likro b'torah b'ta'amim huloli ikuva denifsak ba'orachayim simin kuf mem beisif beis. Maybe technically a woman could read the Torah without laning. She would just read the words without any kind of singing, and you would be say the Kriya. And maybe that's what the Gemara means. But still she can't, not because of Kol B'Isha Erva, but rather Kvod HaTzibur. And number three, says the Tzitz Eliezer, he says, Ikar hatam dematzinu shikvar hirgish beha'omar hagri palaji zal besifro yefei lev chelek shishi, quotes again a Sephardi posek, Rav Palaji, Isha lo tikra b'tzibur b'nei Kvod HaTzibur, inami mipnei maris ha'ayin she'istaklu ba. Va'od the Kol B'Isha Erva. Rav Palaji writes that there are three reasons why a woman may not get an aliyah. Reason number one, it's not Kvod HaTzibur. Reason number two, because people may look at her and may have thoughts when looking at a woman reading from the Torah. And number three, because of her voice. Harei lanu shahagon yefei lelev zal kfar naga beha'amar va'aser be'emes le'isha lelos lemin yeshiva gam mishum kachta Kol B'Isha Erva. So he acknowledges that it's a problem, her voice. Ela shadayin anu tzrichim l'mash she'eleinu la'el, k'dei shelo tiksha adena madua shebigmar v'shulchan aruch lo nizkar mehanach taima. So then why Taka doesn't the Gemara give those as reasons? Why does it only give the reason of Kvod HaTzibur? B'hainu mipnei di'imi shum hanizkar haya efshari limtso b'sha'at hatzorech eze derech shetuchal isha likro b'torah v'la lo minyan shiva ba'ofen hamutar. He says, because the Gemara wants to eliminate all arguments. Because maybe you would say, if the reason that she can't get an aliyah is because of histaklus, because people will look at her, or you're worried about her voice, maybe we'll find a permissible way that she'll be covered in a burqa and she won't lane. And that way no one will see her and no one will hear her voice. But still, das wegen, she still can't be called up to the Torah, because Kol B'Isha Erva. So And that's why, so that's what Rav Waldenberg suggested. 3 reasons why the Gemara says because of Kvod HaTzibor and not because of Kol B'isha Erva. And then the Nishmasa Avraham concludes by saying, because of Li Hagrashaz Oyerbach Zatzal, Efsher Shekulam B'nei Mishpacha Echa, so Shokares Tov, Ach B'li Nigun Shel HaTa'amim Ad Kan Lashono. Rav Shlomo Zalman added another reason. Maybe it's a family simcha, and the reason why she can't get an aliyah is not because of Kol B'isha Erva, because it's not an Erva when you're listening to your sister lane. It's not an Erva. Because a person is not going to be in any way, because the endearment that is created by her voice will not be provocative in that way, right? Or your mother or your daughter, something like that. And then he also concludes by saying, "V'shamati mihagon Reb Ezriel Oyer Bach Shlita shegam chamiv hagrish El Yashiv Shlita heishiv lokein." Reb Yashiv said the same thing. That number one, it could be a family affair. And still, because of Kvod HaTzibor, a woman can't get an aliyah. And also, like Rav Alderberg said, she could read the Torah without Negina Satam, without the trub. Okay, so fine. So what we've seen up until now, this is really an aside, but the point of this exercise is to say that there seems to be no issue of Kol B'isha Erva, provided that it is not a conversation of endearment. Even her reading from the Torah would be permissible in public as long as she's not singing. That seems to be the conclusion that we can draw from the Rav Waldenberg and from Rav Shlomo Zalman. Are you with me so far? So we're building our case that the argument might be that a woman should be allowed to give a Dvar Torah because it's not a problem of Kol B'isha Erva. Okay, so there shouldn't be any problem of a woman teaching, for example, either in a classroom setting or in any kind of public setting where she's acting as an instructor. Okay? However, comes along Rav Vosner and throws a wrench into that. He says, he's responding to one of the Hasidic Rebbes who writes to him at the time, Rav Shalom Yecheskel Shraga Ruben Halberstam, the Admor of Tsiashinov, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and he tells him that you wrote a kuntris about tznius and how women should not be on public display and should not do public speaking. He says, I agree with you, and he says, Mikol makom b'ne'umim b'prat shelo b'inyane mitzvah. He says, when it comes to public speaking, that's what ne'omim, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, b'ne'umim or ne'omim, with public speaking, especially when it's not a mitzvah for her to speak, keven de b'meshach ni'uma darka lahan'im kola ulahachanif hashomim ki yadua, lichora hatzedek im kvod toraso de lo gora mehashava shalom ba'alma da'asor. He says, if a woman's going to get up to speak and is going to offer her salutations to the audience, and she would say, I would like to thank Congregation Beth Avram Yosef for inviting me. You are such an amazing kehillah. You have such wonderful members here. You do amazing things, and the shul is just so wonderful. Rav Vosner felt that too is a type of speech that creates endearment, and therefore he said it's asur. Okay. So we thought we had a way out until Rav Vosner came along and says that any woman who's going to publicly speak, if she's going to be congratulating or offering warm salutations to her audience as her opener for her instruction, this is going to be problematic. Okay?
You don't have any issue with like Shiur Deborah or Shiur Miriam at the Yamsu, which was clearly singing.
Well, Shiras Miriam was in front of women only. It was Vatikach Miriam Haniviyah Chosar Nesatof Biyada Vatetzena Chol Hanashim Achareha Bitupim Uvim Cholot. She went with the women. She was out of earshot from the men. So that's not an issue. Shiras Devora, we don't know who her audience was. It could be that she only sang it between her and the Ribbono Shel Olam, and it was recorded for all posterity by the Nevi'im. So we're not sure who was listening. Okay? Yes.
Member of Parliament, when she wants to come up and give a little talk to Hila?
Yeah, you can give dozens of examples. Now we're going to go to 3 short shuvas of Rav Moshe, and let's see what Rav Moshe has to say on the matter. He was asked about the question of women speaking in shul. He was asked the question of women offering let's say, a prayer from the bima, and he was asked the question of bas mitzvah girls giving a devar Torah. 3 separate shilas. Let's see what we can make of them. So in the most well-known is from Orach Chaim Chelek Hey, Im mutar leisha lahagid shir beveis hakneses. Can a woman give a shir in a shul? Sha'alta im mutar lahaniach leisha lahagid shiur beveit hakneset or beveis medrash shelo bishas hatfila. Your question is, can a woman give a shir in a shul or a beis medrash when it's not during davening? Davening's over. Kegon shebelel Shabbos nahug she'eza balabayas noisein shir beveis hamedrash beparsa sheshavua uboyim lishmoa anoshim v'noshim imuteret isha litena shiur. So let's say the long winter Friday nights, there's a shir in the shul, and they do a rotation every week. Another balabayit gives the shir, gives the parsha shir. And in one particular Friday night, they invite a woman to give the shir. Leil limud, but let's say it's in the shul. Is that okay? Number 1, Rav Moshe says the fact that men and women are mixed together in the crowd, that's not a great thing. That's a chisaron gadol. Aval lo ikanes ladun b'nidon ze lema'aseh. But says Rav Moshe, I'm not going to get involved in that shaila. I'm not here to paskin on that. I'm not happy about it. I'm not crazy about it. But as you could see, he knows his audience. He knows he's speaking to American Jews. And if he were to come down too hard, perhaps, he would not be mikubal. Ve'etzem hagadat hashiur al yedei isha mutar imhu be'akra'i bilvad. 1 second. And he says, a woman giving a shir is no problem, as long as it's not something that's kavua, as long as it's not like every day or every week, but as long as she can be part of a rotation, that's not a problem. V'tzarech lahazhira she'teshev b'davka be'et amirat hashiur she'yeh ba'ofan sanua bi'yoter. But Rav Moshe says, make sure she's seated during the shir, so she's not like moving around in an animated way, so that it's more tsanua. K'mokein yesh lasot zot bebayit prati davka below beveit knesset o beit midrash. And finally, Rav Moshe says, make sure that she does it in a private home. I'm not happy that this should be done in a beis medrash or a beis haknesses. Okay? So what is Rav Moshe paskin? Rav Moshe paskins, for a woman to teach Torah to a mixed audience is perfectly fine, as long as it's not kavua, as long as it's ba'akra'i bilvad, and it should be outside the shul and outside the beis medrash. But why? He doesn't even give a reason. If you no longer have an issue of kol bi'isha erva, then where does this issue of doing it in a beis haknesses, where does this come from? And it could very well be that Rav Moshe was concerned about the irbuvia that could be created in the synagogue. That once we allow women to take a leadership role in public speaking inside the beis knesses, this could lead to the deconstruction of the mechitza, potentially. And Rav Moshe was very concerned about this, especially he's writing at a time when a number of Orthodox shuls had taken down their mechitzas, and it could be that that was his concern. But one thing is clear. Once you've surmounted the issue of kol bi'isha erva, which Rav Moshe feels is not an issue when a woman is teaching Torah to a crowd, then there doesn't seem to be any explicit prohibition that he can point to of a woman speaking in a shul, other than the concerns that he had in the world in which he's writing this. So, but we don't have any indication. I'm not prepared to say that we don't have to listen to it. But what I am just pointing out is that Rav Moshe does not give a reason why there should be any distinction between a house and a synagogue. And I would submit to you come, you tell me what your thinking is. Like, why would Rav Moshe say it's more problematic inside a synagogue than in a private home? What, so, but her Torah is just as holy as a man's. Is it because, I mean, Kedusha Samakom, I don't.
They were part of the basic English where the women were allowed in the man.
Okay,
So,
maybe you could argue that you have to have more separation of men and women in a Beis HaKnesses, just like we know that there's a requirement of a mechitza davka in a Beis HaKnesses, but not, let's say, in a private shiva home. Because you have to have, because this is a public institution of holiness, there has to be added migdar milsa, there has to be added sort of separation between the genders. Okay, perhaps. All right, let's go on to the next tshuva because we need to finish this all on time. Next, Igros Moshe from Chelik Dalid. Im mutter sheisha tomar tefila ba'anglit lifnei ha'anashim. Again, this is a classic out-of-town shul practice. You won't find this in Toronto or any of its environs, but what a lot of shuls used to do, I don't, you know, I know of a shul in Northern California, for example. I would daven there for Shabbos once, and the woman of the shul was the president, and during the services, she got up to say the prayer for the United States in the middle of davening in English. So this is what Rav Moshe is being asked the question. Can a woman get up and say the prayer in English, Lifnei ha'anashim, in front of the men? Umasha oto harav hinig shebe'emsa tefila yoredet isha me'ezrat nashim lebeis hakneses ve'omeret tefila ba'anglit lifnei kol ha'anashim. He says the questioner is saying that he witnessed this in a certain synagogue where the Rav allows a woman to come down from the Ezras Nashim, to come into the main sanctuary, and in the middle of services to recite a prayer in English for the entire tzibur. Upashat shehu davar asur. He says, Rav Moshe says it's obviously prohibited. Upela al Rav orthodoxy sheyase davar kazeh. And he says, I'm amazed, I'm shocked that an Orthodox rabbi would even allow such a thing. Okay, v'harei ata kotev shekvar amar lecha hagon Reb Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman sha'aser, b'hu pashadu bar sha'aser. My Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman, I got smicha from Rav Ruderman. He paskined, Rav Moshe quotes Rav Ruderman, who says that that's aser, and it's pashad and bar. Pashad, and it's obvious and it's clear. V'lo muvan af al Rav zeh imra eze nechitzut sheyitargemu tefila achat ba'anglit v'lomar lifnei hakahal. He says, it's not clear to me why this rabbi found it necessary to have a prayer translated into English in the first place. V'lomar lifnei hakahal v'chilo matza mishi yachol letargem eze tefila ba'anglit lomar lifnei ha'anashim shebachar bi'isha. And why did he dafka have to choose a woman to read this prayer? Couldn't he find a man to read English? Shavadai eno mevi zeh shebachar bi'isha inyan yirat shamayim elo lehefech shezeh gufa hu davar iser. He says, certainly this is not the fact that he's trying to show egalitarianism and inclusiveness by using a woman to recite the prayer. He says, Rav Moshe is not having any of it. This is not, he's not adding yirat shamayim. By including women, if anything, this is the opposite of Yiras Shamayim, and it's no good. Okay? Next. Third shuv of Rav Moshe, Chagigat Bat Mitzvah Bebeit HaKnesset, celebrating a Bas Mitzvah in shul. So, you know, in our shul, we don't have the Bat Mitzvah come up and give a speech. In many shuls, they allow the bas mitzvah to give a speech. Some say it in some shuls, the girl will say it from the Ezras Nashim. Okay, it's for added sniut. But in our shul, we don't permit it at all. All we do is we have the father of the bat mitzvah get an aliyah. We make a mishaberach for the girl. And sometimes, you know, if I see the girl in shul, I'll ask her to get up and I'll wave to her and I'll wish her a mazel tov. And that's it. That's all we do here. But the question is this a problem? Okay, so
But at the bat mitzvah ceremonies where the group will go together, each one individually gives a Torah.
yeah, so that's not in the Beis HaKnesses, that's in the social hall. So that's not part of his question. Howard Beach, New York, from Rav Meir Kahana. Okay, that's the person asking the Shaila. And Howard Beach, you would certainly understand Howard Beach is a place which was considered an out-of-town shul, probably even today as well. B'dvar etzem chagigat bas mitzvah, ein bazeh inyan sudas mitzvah, elahu kesimcha shel yom huledet ba'alma, shehu reshut. So first of all, I just want to clarify, there's no inyan of sudas mitzvah for a bas mitzvah. It's completely optional. V'lachein ein lasot bebeis hakneses, shesuudot hareshut ein lahatir bebeis hakneses, af shenivna kishenivna al tanai. So first of all, making a reception inside the Beis HaKnesses, even if when the Beis HaKnesses was built al tanai, that you could have meals there, but the assumption is only meals that are for simcha, that there's a sudas mitzvah involved. But this is not even a sudas mitzvah, so he says, I'm not happy that you would ever allow that to happen in the sanctuary. It seems like perhaps that Rav Moshe is suggesting that to do a bar mitzvah su'uda in the Beis HaKnesses afterwards, he wouldn't have a problem. Avolasus kiddush beveis hakneses shenogin berov bati knesios de medina zu lasus bechol simcha sheyesh lahadam lo gara simcha zu mishar smacha shaosim shaosim. But to make a kiddush in the back rows afterwards, like a lot of shtibelach where they don't have a social hall, and they'll put up some tables and make a kiddush, that's fine, because people make kiddushes all the time, even when there's no sudas mitzvah. Now, as far as Urusha Gam Loimar, Eza Milim Lechavot Simchasa. And furthermore, says Rav Moshe, it's perfectly fine for the bas mitzvah girl to speak, to give a little speech at her bas mitzvah. V'seh mistaver sheyaski lahato eles shesover kvod torasu sheyesh bazeh. Avolo tomar al habima ela etzel hashulchan shaosin hakiddisham. With the one proviso, you see, basically the Rav is asking, I want to make her feel important. I want to give her that kavod so she should feel that she's not second class to the boy. What can I do to let her have her glory? And Rav Moshe responded, fine, she can give a speech in the shul, provided that it's not on the bima, but rather she should give it by the table where the kiddush is taking place. Okay, so already we're seeing some level of contradiction from the first tshuva to this tshuva that we're seeing now. In the first tshuva that we saw, which was from Chelek Hey, Rav Moshe says a woman should never speak in a Beis HaKnesses. And here Rav Moshe is saying it's okay for the Bas Mitzvah to speak in the Beis HaKnesses, just not from the Bima. Okay, I just want to make that clear that whether or not we notice, whether or not this is so apparent or not, but it does seem to be Rav Moshe is a shtickle soiser himself. Okay. Next, how do we're just going to skip a little bit. How does the Dati Le'umi world comport itself? So I was just looking around online, and I saw from two tshuvas from Rav Yaakov Ariel. Rav Yaakov Ariel was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Yamit. And as you can see from his bio, he's still alive, Kenai Nahara, he's retired now. He's the former chief rabbi of Ramat Gan, a co-founder of Gush Emunim, and et cetera, et cetera. You can read, he has a very illustrious career. So he has online shuvas. And Rav Ariel was asked the following, one shuva in Tafshin Samech Dalid, 5764, and then a follow-up in 5772. So the first shaila goes like this. Ani mitpalel b'Shabbat ba'ofen chad pa'ami bebeit knesset she'isha omeret bo dvar Torah acharei tefillah. I daven occasionally in a shul where a woman gives the dvar Torah after davening. Yesh tzad shel ini imut latzet lifnei dvar haTorah. But it's not nice for me just to walk out. I don't want to make a public stink. Ha'im yesh chiyuv latzet olo. Do I have to leave the shul if a woman is speaking or not? I also, I'm a single guy, so I am hosted by a family where the woman of the family makes kiddush. So, ani lo rotze lehatchil bevikuach. Ha'im ani chayav lidrosh la'asot levad, o sha'ani lidrosh la'asot levad, o sha'ani yotze. So, I don't want to make waves with the family. Do I have to make my own separate kiddush, or should I just be yotze with her kiddush? The second tshuva we're not going to see tonight. That'll be for another evening for us to discuss whether a woman can be motzi a man in Kiddush, whether it's appropriate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know when Miriam, when she came into the room tonight, she has with her a book about Professor Nechama Leibovich. Professor Nechama Leibovich, she was a Beis Yaakov girl, and she gave a class in was it Hebrew University? She taught at Hebrew University for years. There are Talmidim of hers who are still alive, very, very chashuv, Rabbeim, Rashi Yeshiva, who were Talmidim of Nechama Leibovich. So clearly, there doesn't seem to be an issue of going to hear educational seminars from a woman. So, but however, Professor Nechama Leibovich, he testifies, Sirva betokef lahartzot beveit hakneset. She always refused to speak inside a shul. Yesh kan zeliga shahamshacha alul lahavi ta'aroivet shel nashim ugvarim batefila atzma. Why? Because the concern is, and this is what I mentioned before in Rav Moshe's tshuva, the reason why you don't want a woman to speak inside the Beis HaKnesses is because it could spill over to cause men and women to daven together as well. Since a Beit HaKnesset is reserved for segregated prayer, you want to keep everything segregated in that room. L'chein ra'ui likvoa gevulot. B'ma'amadim datiyim b'ikar b'Beit HaKnesset yesh lahafrid bein gvarim lenashim. And therefore, in all manners inside the synagogue, you should try your best to divide between the genders. Im hashir miyuad lenashim bilvad yesh efsharut sheisha tidrosh b'Beit HaKnesset. If the shir is just for women, however, I have no problem if a woman wants to give a shir in the Beis HaKnesses. אתה יכול לצאת לפני סוף התפילה כגון לשירותים כדי שמחאתך לא תיראה שקופה מדי. And therefore, my advice to you is if you don't feel comfortable staying for this woman's Dvar Torah, and you should feel uncomfortable, he says, leave before davening's over when they're up to Yigdal or whatever, and or Adon Olam, and like say, excuse me, I got to go to the washroom, and that way your departure will not be as conspicuous. Okay, and then in Tafshin Ayin Beis, he says, "B'chol Shabbat acharei tefillah, yesh shiur al parshas hashavua b'Beit HaKnesset atzmo ligvarim v'nashim yoshvim b'nifrad." Every Shabbos after davening, there's a shir on the parsha where men and women sit separately. It's a frum place. Arachshav hashiurim nimsru al yedei gvarim bilvad. Hayom yesh isha shegam rotza lahavir et hashiur acharei tefillah b'Beit HaKnesset. Up until now, the shir was always given by a man, but now a woman wants to give the shir. Hayim yesh baya bazeh. Is there a problem with this? So Rav Ariel answers, Im hamedubar b'shir tzamud l'tfilah, davar nira kechelek me'atfilah v'lo mat'im. He says, if it's immediately after davening, without any interruption at all, then it looks like it's a chelek of the davening, and it's not a good thing to do. Ach b'menutak legamre me'atfilah ein isur, im ki ani mefaneh otcha shuv l'divrei Nechama Leibovich. He says, but technically there's no isser for her to give a shir even inside the shul, but I refer you to Nechama Leibovich, what she said, which is from his previous tshuva, that she always didn't want to speak in a shul. Now, with all of that said, I'm going to conclude with just a page from 2 pages, actually, from a sefer called Dor Umin Hagav. This sefer was written by a frum historian in the late 80s, by Rav Shlomo Ashkenazi, who traces so many different community customs in different communities. And when he wants to write, he has a chapter on Nashim Ba'avodat HaKodesh, and he discusses Shenashim Limdu Torah V'gam Limdu La'acherim. We clearly know that women historically in many different Jewish communities of earlier ages taught Torah, both men and women. V'lo od ela b'tekufot shonot anu motzim nashim b'rosh yeshivot. We even find that there were women who were Rosh Yeshiva, believe it or not. Bito shel Reb Shmuel Halevi ben Eli, Rosh Yeshivat Baghdad, nitmaneh legaon b'Baghdad shnat 1164, umeit bein shnot 1194 and 1200, hayta b'kiya b'Talmud v'Tanach. So the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva of Baghdad, who was named Reb Shmuel Halevi ben Eli, or Ben Ali, maybe perhaps. So he was the Rosh Yeshiva in Baghdad in the 12th century. And when he passed away, she was a big chacham. She knew Talmud and Tanakh. Okay? And so about her it is written, Misaper Petachia Regensburg Kidalahalan. Reb Shmuel ein lo banim ela bat echat, v'hi bekiya b'Talmud v'hi melamedet hakriya lebachurim. She used to teach Gemara, and she would teach laning to the boys. V'hi segura b'vinyan derech chalon echad. But what she did for tznius is that she would sit on one side of the wall with a window, v'hatalmidim bachutz ulamata ve'enam ro'im ota, and the kids would be on a lower level on the other side of the wall, so that they wouldn't be able to see her. L'divrei Rabbi Petachia limda mikra kinira min hagdara melamedet hakriya, al Rabbi Petachia atzmo me'id aleha shahita bekiya gam b'Talmud ve'ulai limda tabachrim gam b'Talmud. Okay, so she taught boys, but she did it in such a way that she would not have to be seen. But then we go on to see other Roshei Yeshiva who were women. Shtei nashim, next paragraph, Shtei nashim sheshimshu Roshei Yeshiva. Miriam bas Reb Shlomo Shapiro, Migeza Rashi Yemechayeha Smuchim Limechayeha Shel bas Reb Shmuel Halevi Hanal. She too lives in the 12th century. Me'ever l'shar shel Shilos Utshuvas Rashal Kasuv Harabanit Marat Miriam Tafsa Yeshiva Kama Yamim V'Shanim V'Yashva Ba'ohel V'Lon Lefaneha V'Amra Halacha Lifnei Bachurim Uflagim. She served as a paisek for Yeshiva Bachurim, for the elite yeshiva bachurim, and she sat in front of a veil so that she wouldn't be exposed. Rav Yosef Yozelman, Rav Yosef Kohen Tzedek v'acharim me'idim aleha, shebemesha shanim rabos limda shasu poskim b'yeshiva lifnei talmidim uflagim. B'shas ha-shiurim yashva Miriam mitamid tznius ba'oihel shel vilonot ba'ofen sha-talmidim shamu es koila ve'es paneha lo ra'u. And for tznius, she sat in a tent that was covered with veils so that they would hear her voice but not look upon her. And then he brings a story about Osnas Barzani, which is Lifnei Shalosh Meot V'Chamishim Shana, 350 years ago approximately. Eshet HaChacham Paitan Mechaber Sfarim Benigel V'Nisar Reb Yaakov Barzani, HaChacham Lekilat Amadja, V'Acharechein B'Mosul. So this is in Iraq. Gadol Rabboni Kurdistan Bitkufato, Shekiyem Yeshiva Meforsemet, Haita Askanit, Paitanit V'Lamdanit. So his Rebbetzin, Osnat, was an Askanis. She was involved in the Jewish community. She was a poet, and she was a teacher. Hirbitza Torah B'Yeshiva V'Haita Pe'ila B'Chaya Kila B'Ir Amadeha Shebekurdistan, Misheniftar Bala Amtahi B'Rosh Yeshiva V'Limda Es HaTalmidim. That when her husband passed away, she served as the Rosh Yeshiva. Espaneha gidla v'chincha she'ruim litfos et mekomo shel bala b'chayei hatzibor. She raised her children until they were old enough to fill her husband's position. Michtavim achadim shela nitgalu b'geniza upirseim otam hamelumad Yaakov Man. V'michtavim eila hi pona lakilot Kurdistan u'mivakeshet ezratan lachzakas ha'yeshiva. We found some of her letters that she wrote to the community in Kurdistan in the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, and she writes over there that she was asking the members of the Kurdistan Kehila to support her husband's yeshiva. B'rashei michtavim aktuvim b'signon ivri yafeh mitnosesim piyutim peri ita shel osnat, and she wrote flowery poetry at the beginning of all of her letters. Ad hazman ha'acharon haya matzoi b'mosul ktav yad shala Perush al Mishle. She wrote a whole Perush on Sefer Mishle. Miachsim lagam piyot na shenitfas b'Sefer Shevet Yisrael Beit Hanasi b'Yerushalayim shetochno ga'aguim l'Tzion. She writes poetry about Zion, how she so desires to be in Eretz Yisrael. Zachta laharatzat Yehudei Kurdistan ulekinoi Tanait. So she was widely respected by the Jews of Kurdistan, and they called her the Tanait, which is the feminized version of a Tana. Okay. So with all of this, I just want to conclude with one. I know we've gone over time. Let me just conclude with one thought. And that thought is this. If you're going to ask a shaila that is going to be just vanilla, what's the psak? Give me the bottom line. So we have a number of restrictions for women to engage in cordial conversations with men. And there should be limitations that are placed on that. There's a certain wisdom in placing limits on social interactions between men and women, which is why the more from yeshivish places have separate kiddushes for men and for women. And so, and we know that there are benefits for a segregation of the genders when conversations can go off-road and off the rails. So one has to be especially careful. Despite the concerns that are expressed by the poskim, every adult has to comport himself in such a way where he says, this conversation is not going to cause me to have any kind of sinful thoughts. But if a person knows himself and he feels that having social interaction with a woman that is not his wife could potentially lead him astray, then he should certainly avoid it based on everything that we've learned. As far as the issue of kol b'isha erva, for a woman to give an address to teach Torah, we have to take into consideration Rav Vosner's concern that a woman who's going to speak should went to a mixed crowd should not use flowery speech and engage in niceties to the point where her voice is endearing to the audience excessively. And that is a concern. But in general, teaching Torah to a mixed crowd is perfectly permissible. 100% okay. So if you go to a Leil Limud and a woman is teaching Torah, there's no problem with that. The one thing that remains is teaching Torah in a Beit HaKnesset. And so therefore what we saw two responsa from Rav Moshe. One says never okay, and the other one says for a bas mitzvah girl, as long as it's not from the bima, it's perfectly fine. And so my feeling about this is this. I reserve women speaking in shul to very, very limited situations. When the woman is a distinguished scholar, an expert, or one of the leaders in her field of teaching Torah, I believe that we can make an exception in that situation. But to have a guest speaker come and speak where she could just as easily speak in another room, I'm much more hesitant to allow a woman to speak to the kahal. So what I'm thinking about is that, I know in a few months we're going to be hopefully having a woman speaker, political speaker. That's the kind of speech that I would not feel comfortable having her speak in the Beit HaKnesset, because number one, I don't know how sensitive she would be to some of these issues that are being discussed here about using the niceties in terms of endearment that Rav Vosner was concerned about, whereas perhaps a Rebbitzin who's a Talmidah Chachama would understand, how to restrict herself and comport herself. And so I want to be respectful of that and only limit women speaking in the shul to very, very limited situations where I feel that there's a real to'elet, there's real tachlis in having this woman speak. The last thing that I would say is that some of you have noticed that in the past I've allowed Melissa Lantzman to speak. And I think that there are a couple of reasons, one of which I'm not going to even mention, but Hamevin Yavin. And the other reason is because as a political leader, I feel that we have to make an exception because this is part of our imperative of heavy mispalel lishloma shal malchus, that we have to support the government. We have to support our governmental leaders. And this is for the preservation and the safety of the Jewish community. So that's just to give you an insight into my thinking when I do allow a woman to speak from the Beis HaKnesses. Okay, that's about it for tonight. Okay.